Alex, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
So this piece is a wild ride. I mean, honestly, I'd encourage everybody to check it out. It's called Ikea's Race for the Last of Europe's Old Growth Forests. It just takes a bunch of twists and turns. And the fact that you were really in harm's way personally is just another. I'm glad you're okay based on the insane violence in this story. I mean, talk a little bit about how you even learned about this topic and why you chose to cover it on the ground despite the risks involved.
Yeah, it was something that I found out about a couple of years ago. I was reading in the BBC. There was this news hit about a forest ranger in Romania who'd gotten murdered, and in conjunction with some illegal logging. And in the piece, they mentioned that he was the second forest ranger to be murdered in like a 6-week span, which seemed like a pretty shocking sort of episode of violence for a country that's obviously an EU member state. It's not the sort of place where you would expect that sort of thing to be happening generally. So I read that, started looking into it. Kind of one thing led to led to another, as these things often do. And I found out first that Ikea is the largest private landowner in Romania, and that this illegal logging is happening on a massive scale. And kind of the pieces started falling together, and eventually decided to go out there and do some reporting on the ground.
So your piece opens with a terrifying story not involving you. Could you just take the audience through that? I mean, I think that's a great conduit into the larger topics we'll be discussing.
Yeah, sure thing. It starts out, there were two local documentarians, a director and a videographer, basically working on a project also about illegal logging in Romania, which is obviously a local concern as much as anything. And they've been shadowing this environmentalist named Tiberiu, who is well known in parts of Romania. He's got a big Facebook following, and he over the last 5 years has done a lot of work rooting out illegal logging, confronting loggers, chasing down trucks full of contraband. And so they were shadowing him for 4 days as part of their shoot. And on the final day, they went to go investigate what they assumed was an illegal logging site. They got a tip that there was one. They went to check it out. And when they got there, they obviously found the stumps that they were looking for, and called what they thought, I guess, was the forest ranger to come investigate. And they were greeted instead by 2 cars full of attackers, basically like 15 men wielding bats and axes, who jumped out and just besieged them effectively. All 3 of them ended up in the hospital. 2 of them were knocked out. They really, I think, attempted to kill Tiberiu, who has a reputation as an environmentalist in this region. And it was just kind of horrifying attack. And it happened actually, I think, the day after I'd arrived in Romania. So I knew that there were these risks involved. I kind of read about some of the previous attacks, and then obviously got very real very quickly, because right away there was this this major assault that resulted in all 3 of them being hospitalized.
Yeah, and that's not the only attack of that nature on environmentalists and journalists. I mean, you highlight them a little bit later. Can you talk about like the history a little bit of how frequent these attacks on people looking a little bit more into the illegal deforestation, how there is a history of that more than just the initial terrifying story that you talk about at the outset?
Yeah, I think the official tally, as I've seen it, is that there have been 6 murders in the last couple of years in relation to illegal logging, either forest rangers or environmentalists who've been killed, and then another 650 odd attacks of various sorts. So with bats or axes or guns or any sort of anything from attempted murder to sort of hand-to-hand brawling. But those numbers are obviously probably very low. Those are just the official tallies. I think this sort of thing is almost day in, day out for people who are in this line of work. And and it's obviously it's incredibly commonplace, and it's very dangerous for those who are involved.
So let's talk a little bit about Romania as the home to the Amazon of Europe, which is an apt way, as you write, to talk about it in more ways than one. One, based on its importance environmentally, and two, the way it's been rapidly deforested. Can you talk a little bit about the history there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting history, I think, and for various reasons, the industrialization of Europe even plays a big role in this. But Romania happens to have more than half. Some estimates would put it even closer to 70% of the remaining old growth forest left in Europe, outside of Scandinavia. So this sort of temperate old growth forest. And, Europe has been heavily deforested. Obviously, I think it's less than 4% of European forest land remains intact, but Romania, for various reasons, it's far from industrial centers. It was a closed off communist state for a long time, has this incredible forest land in the Carpathian Mountains. And it's exceptionally important for a lot of reasons. One of which is biodiversity. Obviously, old growth forest is super important for maintaining that biodiversity. It's an incredibly lush ecosystem. Also important for climate reasons. The carbon capture abilities of an old growth forest outstrip any other technology that we have to do that. So it's important for a lot of reasons, and now is obviously very much in the crosshairs of the global timber market and in the furniture industry in particular. And so, since Romania joined the EU, basically this forest has been disappearing at like an astonishing rate.
Right. So, take us a little through that history back to the fall of the Soviet Union, which opened them up to privatization. I did not expect to see Harvard University and their endowment involved in this story. I mean, there are so many crazy intertwining actors in this. It just blew my mind, truly.
The Yeah, it is kind of a stranger than fiction story, but if you start from the beginning, when communism ends in 1989 in Romania, obviously all the forest land was publicly held at that point, and there's an attempt to privatize, to re-privatize some of these land holdings. And obviously, this is the story in so many of these post-communist states that that program was marred by corruption. It was insanely addled in every way by backroom dealings and dubious actors. And because of that, a bunch of people end up buying up forest land who are, they're not Romanians, they're not even people who have any interest in forests as such. They're just people looking to make a quick buck. And one of those groups is the Harvard University Endowment, which is, one of the great institutional investors of our time. And they, not for nothing, many of the leaders of Harvard have also had close ties to the World Bank and the IMF and the organizations that cheered these sort of privatization schemes on. And they get tipped off effectively that there's a lot of land to be had on the cheap, and they start buying it up in 2004. They start buying up parcels, and quickly they become the largest private landowner in Romania, I think, outside of the church at that point. And obviously this stuff
Now that's IKEA, right? So
yeah.
So first the Harvard Endowment becomes the number one landowner in Romania, and now that's IKEA. So how much of that was transferred over to IKEA? How much of that was sold, I should say, to IKEA?
Oh yeah, a lot. I think an overwhelming percentage of it actually is. Harvard gets in a little bit of legal trouble for their acquisition. Obviously, no surprise, a lot of these holdings were illegally acquired or done so in such dubious fashion that actually the businessman that they were working with on the deal got a 3-year suspended sentence because of that deal. And they were looking at some legal challenges, and rather than deal with them, they just decided to sell. And the buyer, the ready and willing buyer, was IKEA. So IKEA, I think, ended up buying something like 30,000 odd hectares from Harvard, and then they've compiled more and more forest land ever since. And I think they now own about 50,000 hectares, which puts them, far and away the number one private landowner in the country.
So I mean, what makes the ancient forests like these particular forests, you touched on it a bit, but the fact that it's so effective, the old growth forest is the right term, for carbon capture. what makes this appealing to, say, IKEA in terms of, like, I don't know, why can't they just cut down some regular wood? I know that sounds stupid, but is it just they're because of deforestation globally, they're running out? I mean, what is the financial incentive for a major corporation like IKEA to target these really just important forests?
I think it's a couple of things. One, obviously, land is fairly cheap in Romania, and labor is very cheap, especially for in the broader EU. So you can get your hands on these forests for a pretty favorable price, and you can pay people to get the logs out of there for a pretty favorable price as well. The reality is, IKEA is the largest wood consumer on the planet. It's the largest individual wood, I think, processor and retailer on Earth. There are estimates to say that they consume at least 1% of wood every year globally. They're growing by 2 million trees a year on average, maybe even more than that now. And so they have a huge appetite. I mean, the amount of wood that they consume is just astonishing. And so they have a major investment in Eastern Europe and Russia. That's really where their supply chain is located. And so it's not like they're seeking out old growth forests in particular. Just they have such a demand for wood, and that's where they are. It just happens to be the place where this incredibly important old growth forest is also located.
So then I guess take us to Romania's admission into the EU. The 1989 Soviet Union collapses. Romania is no longer communist, moving towards like rapid privatization, and the neoliberal vultures are circling all of the former Soviet territories. I mean, there are parts of this that are prescient and or not prescient, but important for say what we're talking about with Ukraine. But we can keep that aside for a little bit. Then Romania gets admitted into the EU later, and the deforestation accelerates to a shocking degree. Take us through that period of history.
Sure. Yeah. And it kind of touches on one of the interesting, one of the inherent contradictions at the heart of the EU, where, the Romania goes in, I think exceeds in 2005. And these estimates are kind of rough because there's not great monitoring even, but from 2007 onward, between half and 2/3 of virgin forests in Romania has been destroyed. So it's pretty much right on schedule with Romania's entry into the EU. And the reason is, of course, that joining the EU exists to facilitate global trade in a lot of ways. It's to expedite commerce in many senses. And of course, getting rid of these national boundaries made it much easier for a company like IKEA to operate, or even other there are other companies that are out there as well. There are huge Austrian mills, timber processors who are out there, and they're able to set up shop very easily because there are no obstacles anymore to doing so, and the labor is so cheap, which makes it even more of an incentive for these companies based elsewhere in Europe to really hone in there. And that's the sort of economic reality of the EU. The flip side is that the EU also has made these climate and biodiversity commitments that are fairly substantial, and so now they desperately want to protect this forest because it plays a critical role in those pledges, and they're basically powerless to do so, or they're struggling to figure out what they can do to prevent this deforestation from becoming total.
Oh yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned like some of like I don't know. I This is such a shallow thought, but just based on how IKEA presented itself, I was like, this is an okay company. I mean, right? Like they tout their environmental bona fides. They are like aesthetically Scandinavian, which maybe like it comes off as clean. I mean, look, I'm Swedish. I mean, I'm not Swedish. I'm Finnish and I'm Norwegian. I'm not Swedish. So like I guess aesthetically I'm into what the way it presents itself. Again, this is such a shallow like thought that I've had, but they did market themselves as environmentally sustainable. What was fascinating in your piece was how they kind of get around that by using an NGO certification from the FSC, which has been fairly heavily criticized by like a more reputable Greenpeace organization. I mean, talk a little bit about how they present themselves in such a way, but aren't when you scratch a little bit below the surface, it's not the case.
Ikea has a really good brand management strategy, and they tell a very compelling environmental story about their sustainability. You'll see those pledges all over the store. You can get a vegan hot dog when you go there. It's obviously very effective.
That's part of it too, right? It's like the yeah, exactly. Go on.
yeah. And they're good. Yeah, it's a great vegan hot dog. Yeah, the sort of the sustainability pledge or the model that they put forward is all predicated on this FSC certification. That's basically what they use as a stand-in for sustainable. And I think 98% or something of the manufacturers and mills and stuff that they contract with are FSC certified, and their own forests are FSC certified. And if you actually look into what that means, there's just no way that the FSC could even enforce a meaningful standard of sustainability. And so the way it operates is just a tiny international NGO that has a stamp, and it deputizes other independent organizations to give out that stamp. And the way it happens is, if I'm a manufacturer, if I'm, say, one of the companies that makes the pieces of a folding chair for IKEA, I call up that company and I say, hey, I need you to come inspect my operation. It's planned ahead of time. The manufacturer pays the inspector themselves, and if they refuse to grant them the certification, they can just shop it around to a different group that's also deputized to give the stamp, and eventually someone will give it to them. And so, it's one of these things where if you really look closely at the operation, you can see there's no meaningful enforcement mechanism. There would be no way to even have enough manpower to really assess, what's tens of thousands of acres of forest land and millions of trees, and it's a really good, it's a very effective branding strategy. IKEA founded the FSC. It was one of the founding members 30 years ago. It's not really a meaningful environmental standard.
Well, okay, so the company, I mean, the NGO that they helped found is giving them a great environmental certification. So, I mean, wow, case closed, right, Alex?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And another part of your piece that was really interesting talks about how like there are some EU regulations, environmental regulations, but they skirt it entirely. Something like you write, only 1% of illegal wood gets officially reported. How are they able to do such a thing? I mean, we'll get back to the violence in a second and the lawlessness that allows for this kind of exploitation, but what is the enforcement and how are there really zero legal consequences for this?
It's one of these things that it's an expression as much of general corruption as anything else. And Romania, as many of these post-communist states after liberalization and privatization, it's a notoriously corrupt country. It's the sort of rankings that I think Transparency International is an annual ranking, and Romania is always last or tied for last in terms of corruption in the EU. The government did a survey on illegal logging just to get a sense of how bad the issue was. They thought it was, it wasn't great. And the report came back that like 55% of the wood taken out of Romania every year is illegally logged. And the number was like so startling to them that they tried to suppress the report. And of course, it eventually got leaked. And, the large companies like Ikea who were out there were like, well, that's not ours is the 45% that's fine. And of course, it's totally ridiculous, right? And as you mentioned, like only 1% of that illegal wood ever gets detained. There's a forest guard they chartered in 2015, but it only has 617 members. They don't work nights or weekends. Even if you catch a logger or a trucker in the midst of some illegal activity, you can't really detain them. Only the police can do that, and they have to call the forest guard. It just doesn't. There's just no meaningful enforcement mechanism, and like it would just take so much visibility and manpower and those things that just aren't there. And so obviously this regime has set in, and lawlessness is basically the standard.
Right. And you experienced that firsthand. So, I mean, let's now dive into when you went to report on this story. It was quite dangerous and you had some fears for your physical safety given like the the story that you open up with, where they were two filmmakers or journalists and an environmental activist, if I'm not mistaken,
That's right.
both beaten severely, at least one of them beaten unconscious. So you knew all of this going into this reporting, and you still went anyway. I mean, let's talk a little bit about your experience and what you saw with your own eyes, and some of the threats that you face of just encounters with loggers that you didn't know if you'd be like beaten up in the forest and no one would find you.
Yeah. So the research I did, I tagged along with a researcher who was compiling a report to the European Commission, so to the European Union, for its investigation into into Romania's basically inability to stem its illegal logging issues, especially in these protected old growth forests. And so he's someone who's done a lot of work in this. He takes a ton of precautions. And so, we had a rental car, which couldn't be traced, back to his house readily. We went largely on weekends when the logging site shouldn't have been active. We went in the afternoons when you would expect there to be less activity. We used a drone for a lot of the photo and video footage compiling so that we could maintain a safe distance. And even for in the piece, I refer to him by a fake name because he has to work undercover basically for his own safety. So we took a lot of precautions, and oftentimes would give our location to another person who was off site, that if something did go terribly wrong, they would know in broad strokes where we were. So there were, we did our best to be as safe as possible, but obviously there were still some moments that got pretty hairy.
I mean, talk a little bit about those moments if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. There were a couple in particular. One, there was one site that we had identified from satellite imagery that looked like it had been logged in the last 12 months. It was an old growth forest, largely spruce, some beech as well. And on our way to that site, we actually encountered a placard that indicated there was logging going on. Legal logging had happened a couple months prior, but the certification had expired. But we could hear the sound of chainsaws. There were recent truck tracks in the mud, and there was plenty of indication that this was ongoing. So we went up the logging road, and of course we found a bunch of logs freshly cut. It was very clear what was going on. You could hear the trees falling in the forest, and there was a logger's hut with smoke coming out of the chimney. So we knew it was active. We tried to be as careful as we could, and get some documentation of this. And while the drone was up in the air filming it, one of the loggers spotted us and started coming after us. And so we had to make kind of a split decision. We couldn't get the drone down in time. There was just no way to do it. So Andre, who I was with, jumped in the car, and I got in the passenger seat, and I flew the drone basically overhead. And he drove off until we could get to like a safer location where we could land the drone and then get out of there for good. And so we got down to a lower elevation, got the drone, and then of course the logger who was following us basically caught up to us a second time, and we finally did get out of there, and we were fine. But it was one of those things where it certainly had the potential to go awry, and it's not like we had phone service or anything like that. So which actually in some sense was an asset because the logger couldn't call for backup or anything like that. But there were some harrowing moments. We had another confrontation later on in an Ikea owned forest where we saw some illegal logging and ended up just confronting the logger who was engaged in it. And that too, obviously could have escalated into something worse than it was, but thankfully it was, it never got too violent.
Yeah, thankfully. I mean, it based on, again, the stories that you tell, that sounds terrifying. I mean, do you have a sense of like once there is illegal logging, how the product is then sold with very little oversight or transparency to a major corporation like IKEA? I mean, is it just like the buyers are not asking questions? Is that really how it goes down?
Yeah, it's just hard to tell. Even if you have the best of intentions, which I don't think is the case necessarily, but even if you were to grant the best of intentions, the way that the supply chain works here is that someone owns a forest, they sell a concession to a logging company. The company cuts as many trees as they're supposed to cut, and then probably a few more because they have to sell every log that they cut, and they sell those logs to a depot. The illegal logs and the legal logs at that point are all mixed up together. You have no idea which one is which. And then, a furniture manufacturer will buy, or a mill will buy the logs from the depot. They'll turn them into, process them into boards. And then a furniture manufacturer will buy the boards from the mill, and they'll make, the three pieces of a folding chair that end up getting, boxed up and packaged as the IKEA, folding chair that's sold for $25 or whatever. It's just really hard to trace it. And, you can, to get a sense of how rampant this is, you could follow, a log and these trucks are not hard to find full of illegal logs, and you can follow them to shipping yards that, supply manufacturers that work with IKEA. There was an Al Jazeera news team that did this 2 years ago, and they found, right away, the manufacturer called Chronospawn makes chipboard for IKEA. They saw illegal logs going into their yard. It was, it's pretty open and shut. But in terms of on a large scale, or in terms of sussing out which log is illegal and which one is savory, is basically it's basically impossible.
And then in terms of prosecution, there's been even with the beatings, like, it's one thing to attempt to crack down on the illegal logging in and of itself, right? Which, like, the systems clearly are not set up to allow for that at this current moment. But for beating somebody unconscious and bloodying them, one would think that there should be a criminal system that would deal with that adequately. Like, these cases don't even seem to be brought. Seem to be. You write about how these cases aren't even really brought to trial. What's your understanding of, like, some of the corruption that's clearly involved in Romania?
Yeah. There are a couple of cases. There was one, this environmentalist named Gabby Pond, who started an NGO called oh god, the name escapes me now. But anyways, he's an environmentalist in Romania. He was beaten in an attack in 2015. The entire attack was caught on camera. He was traveling, I think, with a videographer, and the whole thing was caught on film. I met up with him in Bucharest while I was there, and he was still delivering documents as proof of the damage that he had sustained from that attack to the prosecutor, which still hadn't filed charges. And this was almost 7 years later at that point, and he had since gone into hiding, for fear of his own life, and had left Romania entirely, actually, at a certain point. And that's pretty standard. There was the murder that I mentioned at the beginning of this our conversation. Initially, I thought I'd be able to talk to his family, and what I ended up hearing was that the family had been paid off. Basically, their silence had been effectively purchased. There's a widow, a wife with 3 children. It wasn't worth it for her to go through the process of a prosecution, even though it could have been fairly straightforward. They just took a settlement from I'm not sure who, and wouldn't talk. So, these things don't go to trial, even with open and shut video evidence and willing, victims of the attacks. They still are basically, those attacks basically are done with impunity.
And in terms of, again, just going back to IKEA's complicity in all of this, I was not aware until reading your piece about how much explosive growth the furniture industry is likely to experience in the next few years. This means that likely these practices are going to get even more robust and thus shadier, probably, unless my second and final question will be if IKEA even responded to your piece. But first, I want to talk about the growth of the furniture industry and the role that plays in what you saw and what you reported on.
Sure. Yeah. I looked at a market research report that had, I think, indicated that the fast furniture industry would grow from it was supposed to almost double between 2020 and 2025, I think, was the forecast. So obviously it's a huge growth sector. It's not just IKEA now. Obviously it's Wayfair, and there's distributors on Amazon like Zinus, and I think it's an interesting sector because it's also an expression of rising housing prices and cost of living. And if you are paying all your money on rent, you can't spend a bunch of money on furniture that you're going to have for a long time. You get the cheapest furniture you can possibly get and
Yeah,
expect to throw it away in 12 months or less. Um,
I know. I've
and
experienced that myself. It does not pay
yeah,
off. Cheap furniture does not pay off.
yeah. I mean, me as well, certainly. But it's kind of an interesting, it's the sort of flip side of some of these larger sort of economic trends that we know to be the case is that, yeah, people would once buy furniture and assume they were going to have it for many years, if not decades. It was like a permanent fixture of your life. And now, because of the way the housing market is, that just isn't a decision that especially young people make. And IKEA is certainly like a millennial consumable brand in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's the convenience of flat pack furniture has been very alluring, and obviously it's a massive growth market now.
So lastly, your piece, it came out around 3 weeks ago, something like that. Has there been a response by IKEA? I mean, have you seen any like ripples? Because it's nuts. Again, I really encourage everybody to check it out in the New Republic.
Thanks. I ran a bunch of questions by them for a comment while I was doing the reporting. They they didn't respond initially. I kind of pestered them for a while and got the sort of like boilerplate um, answer that they are not involved with old growth forests, period, under any circumstance. Which of course is ridiculous. I went there and saw it. I stood in the midst of it. So it's just beyond that there wasn't much to they didn't offer much. I think I was wondering if there would be a response after the piece published. There hasn't been. IKEA did just mention that they're going to be exiting the Russian market entirely, both in terms of selling and sourcing wood, which is actually going to I think will put more pressure on Romania just because that's where their supply chain is located. As I said before, 60% of their wood comes from Eastern Europe and Russia, so it's going to continue to be a problem. I think that's probably part of the reason they were hesitant to respond, because ultimately that's the model, and they're not going to change that just because of a little bad publicity. So yeah, that's pretty much all they offered me.
Well, Alex Sammon of the American Prospect, you can read his work there, and then also this piece in the New Republic, as I mentioned. Thank you so much for your time today, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you too.